Hi, my name is Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan, and every week during Islamophobia Awareness Month 2019, I'm releasing a different unboxing video to get to grips with one of the most talked about and least understood oppressions of our time, Islamophobia. This week we're unboxing the consequences on the world, media and Muslim women. So far we've looked at the term itself, the colonial history, the counter-terror logic that sees all Muslims as criminal at every level of society, and so it only remains to look at the consequences of all of this. Now there's a lot to unpack obviously in all of this, and this box only touches on the surface of these things, but the first thing that we find inside is the global war on terror, and the fact I didn't have access to a printer this week. Now, the perpetuation of the Islamophobic belief in the existence of violent, uncivilized Muslims over there, who are always a threat to us over here, has been the justification for decades of war, invasion, resource extraction, and the increasing accumulation of power by states domestically. We all know that the war on terror is not about ending violence. The oxymoron in the term itself gives that away, as well as the fact the initial terrorists the war was against were funded, supported, equipped, and trained by the CIA, amongst others. But suggesting it is a war on terror means that geopolitical interests of different nation-states have been played out and secured in the name of increasing global security against the baddies. So the war on terror and its logic has empowered authorities to legitimize their foreign policy and increase in authoritarian power at home, whilst shielding them from any criticism or need to adhere to human rights. It's been possible through the dehumanization of those in the countries we call Muslim countries and the global south, as well as Muslims and people of color in general. The dehumanization of Muslims and those perceived to be has meant that there are few calls for accountability for the hundreds of thousands of Afghans or Iraqis and countless others who have been killed, tortured, maimed, displaced or worse, or the countless people made non-citizens or detained in places like Guantanamo Bay, or those deprived of due civic process, those forced into human trafficking, those traumatized, existing in inhumane conditions, or the thousands under surveillance or investigation, or the expansion of secret services like the MI5. Even the refugee crisis is talked about as something distant and unrelated to the policies of countries like the UK and US in the past few decades. Because the war on terror has been of such huge political significance and importance to states in enabling them to accumulate power and resources, it has to be sustained. And that brings us to the second thing in this box. Now, I wasn't sure exactly how to depict it, so please bear in mind, this is the Islamophobia industry. The Islamophobia industry consists of a whole range of people employed to essentially keep up a negative image of Muslims as violent, uncivilized, patriarchal, barbaric, treacherous and evil. You know those images. It comes from self-described experts employed by news agencies to major media companies to think tanks to secret services who make huge profits off promoting Islamophobia. It almost seems as if there's a consensus on manufacturing the image of an enemy Muslim in the media. Nearly every article and news story about Muslims is negative. But also, as research has shown, nearly every single one of these stories is fabricated or misleading to some degree. And that reveals there is clearly profit to be made in appealing to the consensus of a society in which Muslims are vilified. And that vilification justifies us not holding infrastructures accountable, but simply feeding into a wider consensus. And that consensus is not just amongst the right or fascists, by the way, but mainstream liberal sources. So that includes the rise of those who call for the reform of Islam, or pit good Muslim examples to further condemn the bad Muslims, or asks Muslims to condemn terrorist acts. These things still fall into the Islamophobic trap of criminalizing Muslims and making our humanity conditional upon us proving our own distance from other Muslims, or from Islam, or at least making the admission that Islam is barbaric even if we are not. Is that not just Islamophobia too? And actually the best example of liberal Islamophobia is in the way Muslim women are talked about. Often self-proclaimed feminists and liberal lefties who would hate to be seen as racists end up supporting foreign policies and military interventions that lead to absolute destruction in the name of saving Muslim women. They think it's acceptable to debate whether and how Muslim women should dress and whether this should be legislated. This is from the same people who would condemn the non-consensual dressing or undressing of non-Muslim women and say the state should never have a role in telling women how to dress. But they refuse to see forcibly removing or legislating Muslim women's dress as sexual harassment or misogyny. Which brings us nicely to the final thing in this box, the consequences of Islamophobia on Muslim women. Of course, I had no other symbol I could draw for this image. These consequences are specific and awful. We know Muslim women are the most talked about, most overly represented image of Islam, and especially of Islam as a threat, a danger, a force for bad. Why so much focus on women? Well, because throughout colonialism, colonial powers saw women's bodies, both physically and ideologically, as a battleground in which they could exert and symbolize their dominance. Rape, as we know for example, is a frequent method of war, a representation of domination. But ideologically too, we see women understood like this. Now, because women are seen to be the reproducers of national culture, both biologically and culturally, e.g. even if they don't have children, they're seen to be the ones who bring up the next generation and pass on norms to them, it's always been important, therefore, to capture women in order to define cultures and nations and their futures. So, the French, when they colonised Algeria, would have unveiling ceremonies to show the superiority of French culture over Algerian culture in the 20th century. But you can actually go on Google and search an image of Oprah Winfrey unveiling an Afghan woman after the US invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. This use of Muslim women's bodies to fight out ideological battles happens non-stop. Concern with how Muslim women dress is usually articulated as a concern for women's rights. But what does that mean when those rights are fast conflated with cultural domination, military invasion, and conquest, which decimate women's lives? Conversations about hijab bans, burqa bans, FGM, forced marriage, etc., when it comes to Muslim women, rarely has to do with concern about us, but a desire to say something about the problematic nature of Muslims, and to hide the causes of misogyny as something political rather than cultural, something rampant in the West, part and parcel of colonialism, rooted to capitalism, inherent in the discourses about Me Too, etc. But instead, by making women's issues something cultural, attaching it to Muslims, the inherent politics of gender relations is hidden, and Muslims are made out to be consistently other. In the UK, we've seen this with Ofsted wanting to make sure girls aren't being forced to wear scarves at school. We've seen the Department for Communities and Local Government wanting to make sure Muslim women speak English as part of countering terrorism. Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, objectifying Muslim women as bank robbers and letterboxes, criminals and objects to be acted upon. But there is no concern for the fact that 48% of Muslims live in the top 10% most deprived areas in the UK. What impact does that have on Muslim women? Or that 5.1% of Muslims in the UK are homeless compared to 2.2% of the general population. How might that be affecting Muslim women's welfare? Or that we're disproportionately under and unemployed, with Muslim women in particular facing huge racial, gendered and Islamophobic barriers and structural violence at every level of education and employment. And that 15% of the prison population is Muslim compared with 5% of the overall population. What impact does that have on men, on women, on homes, on futures, on lives, on trauma? These socio-economic and political outcomes of Islamophobia are rarely talked about because they reveal that women's lives are structured by political factors and that perhaps Muslims and Islam are not the single biggest barrier Muslim women face in life. Admitting this, though, would cause the entire discourse which upholds and enables states to achieve their geopolitical goals and accumulate further power to be discredited, and might mean we'd actually have to think about the political structures that shape our lives. But that sounds a little bit complicated, eh? Thanks for joining me this week, and come back next week for the final unboxing video of Islamophobia Awareness Month 2019. I'll be addressing and unboxing any of your remaining questions about Islamophobia, so please comment them below.